All right. Welcome
Ready
to
to
the
go?
next episode.
All right, so this episode is going to be focused on helping people interpret what we call the foundations page. And so if you haven't discovered that yet, you can find it at iit.wiki/foundations. And as we've mentioned, these first couple episodes are really just trying to unpack the content that's already written on those pages, but to do it from the angle of conversation, just talking it through. It gives us a chance to go a bit more into a few rabbit holes that we didn't get into in the text and so on. So the beginning of this page kicks us off with what we call in IIT the zeroth axiom. What do we mean by, why do we even call it the zeroth axiom?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, so the zeroth axiom of IIT is supposed to be, it's intended to be a sort of ground truth, right? That is the starting point of our investigation of consciousness. And it is also the starting point of defining our the subject matter. So what we are trying to explain, but also where we are starting from, because in this case, the two things coincide, right? It is called an axiom because there is no further grounding except the truth of the statement itself that we are relying on. And in this case, it's the very fact that the experience exists. So we are having an experience, I am having an experience, you are having an experience. And this goes back to, in a sense, if you want, philosophically, the idea that already Descartes brought up with the cogito argument that having an experience is a fact, is a truth, is something that you cannot doubt about. And you can be mistaken about everything else. You can be mistaken about experiencing, for instance, that there is an elephant in the room, but you cannot be mistaken about the fact that you experience the elephant being there. Maybe the elephant is not actually there in the room, other people don't see it, but you cannot be mistaken about having the experience you're having, basically, or actually
So,
having an experience in
so,
general.
so, so let me just interrupt you a sec. So IIT is a scientific theory of consciousness. And there are many other scientific theories of consciousness, and I think none of them um, is as, let's say, systematic as flagging from the very beginning such an axiom. I mean, calling it an axiom, calling it the zeroth axiom, having to even assert that experience exists. Um, why does IIT do this? Why does IIT really emphasize this as a starting point? I mean, also if we think about this theory in light of, let's say, the world of consciousness research, why is this somehow important to kind of, let's say, stake our flag very clearly from the beginning?
Well, I think one way at least is, just to make clear that there is no fundamental illusion there. This thing is an experience, is there, and it's irrefutable. It's true that, like Matteo said, that the experience is, so to speak. You're not claiming anything about the contents of the experience necessarily. You're just saying that there is something. Something exists, and the something is, what should I say, experiential in nature. It's there for some experiencer, so to speak.
So usually, both in philosophy and science, when sometimes when people talk about consciousness, talk about it as this mysterious, intriguing, extra phenomenon that seems to be very hard to reconcile with our understanding of the natural world. And one question is, what exactly is consciousness? How do we define it? When does it appear? When is it generated and why? And is it, characterized specifically by, for instance, a specific kind of metacognition or self-awareness? Does it kick in when you get to a certain level of complexity of cognitive functions? And on top of that, we can also ask the question: Is consciousness, does it really exist, in the sense of, is it really something? Is there something special that appears at a certain level of complexity that makes, so to speak, the lights turn on and animals become conscious? They have this self-reflective awareness, or these kind of things. So there is one approach that is searching for this mysterious additional ingredient, right, that make things self-aware, conscious, and usually this takes consciousness as the end of a process, right? It is, we're trying to find how it comes out of a lot of other things that we know happen in the biological world.
And that you
the
can
approach
kind of
of
think
IIT,
of, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that there's like often an assumption there that all of these things could have gone on in the dark, so to speak, without any. Sorry to interrupt.
Precisely. So we're trying to see what is this extra thing that happens, this extra ingredient once we have all the physical and biological properties in place. And this indeed brings some people to have the legitimate doubt that maybe there is no such thing that kicks in at a certain point, or there is no emergent property that appears magically at a certain step of complexity, but that consciousness really is just an illusion. We think that there is this extra property, but there isn't. And so this is the illusionist / physicalist, reductionist, materialistic traditional view that for a long time has been associated with hardcore natural sciences. The maybe surprising or counterintuitive or novel and original approach that IIT takes is, in a sense, it's the opposite, and saying, well, but hold on a second. So why don't we start, instead of starting from what we know about the physical world, why don't we start from consciousness itself? We take the fact that consciousness exists as our starting point, because ultimately, even when we experience an external world, we are experiencing it, right? So we are having an experience. And we just accept that experience exists, and then we try to characterize it in its properties. We try to build a science of consciousness that starts from the assumption that experience exists as a fact, as a starting fact. And this connects to the idea that already pointed out by Descartes, that we can doubt about the existence of an external world. We can be mistaken about possibly physics being what we think it is, physical properties working the way they work, but we cannot be mistaken about having an experience, our experience being there. So that is why, according to IIT, is a better foundation to just start from this truth. This is zeroth, so to speak, axiom that just says experience exists.
And so you mentioned Descartes a few times there. Are there, so, and we also use that in the wiki as like a helpful, what should I say, analogy for how you can think about this axiom. But are there, we also say sometimes that there are differences in this claim compared to what Descartes said. Are there, I'm a little bit unclear on that. Can you guys say something about that? What's different in IIT's which I say zeroth axiom compared to Descartes' claim?
If you want, I can take a stab, and Matteo can correct me. I mean, Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," and we're certainly not the first in the last 500 years to point out that he might be smuggling in an I there, where you don't have to, and so, I mean, I think some commentators have said a more elegant way of expressing the same sentiment would be something like thinking is happening, or something in that direction, rather than, I think. Thinking is happening, therefore something exists, something in that direction. So IIT would certainly agree with that, but it would even go a step further to say that even thinking, right, this saying cogito, or to think, or that I think, would be too specific in what kind of an experience we're even talking about. So IIT takes the same sentiment and tries to make it as general as possible, simply saying experience exists. We know there, an experience is happening right now, right? That I'm sure of. Whether an I really exists, etc., none of that matters here. I know that that an experience is happening, therefore I can be sure that an experience exists, at least right now.
Or at least
Maybe
something
it'll
exists,
go out of existence. It might go out of existence in a split second from now, but right now it does exist. And one other bit of that maybe we could add to it is Descartes, Matteo, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Descartes used the cogito statement more or less to ground his epistemology, to ground his ideas about what he can know. And he didn't use it as much to ground an ontology. And IIT tries to take that one step further and say it not only can ground our epistemology, but it can also be the safest grounds for our ontology. So also tying that into what Matteo was just bringing up, we see this instinct, let's say, in when people take the initiative to try to explain consciousness scientifically, the place they start from is the scientific view of the outside world that we have already, right? Standard view of physics, whatever we know from neuroscience, etc. And then they tried to, if you will, squeeze out consciousness from that, saying, okay, how might it emerge from this? And IIT is asserting in the Cartesian tradition, saying, wait a minute, all of that stuff you know about the outside world, it's excellent, but you have to recognize it starts from, first, the fact that you're experiencing the world itself, right? You're making an inference to whatever's going on in the outside world. And the basis of that inference is first and foremost that you're having an experience. So IIT tries to stake that very clearly to say, no matter what else we discover through our inferences about an ontological view, meaning about what exists out there, no matter what else we discover, we can't pull the rug out from experience itself, right? As being the foundation of everything else that we not only learn about in an epistemological sense, but also posit to exist in an ontological sense.
Yeah, so this comes back, I guess, then to what we talked about last time and the time before that briefly about IIT being consciousness first, or flagging that, or carrying that banner of being explicitly consciousness first without that making the theory subjective, right? Or
yeah,
precisely.
Yeah, and maybe one thing we can add also is that, and we will see this more when we talk about the other axioms, but Descartes, in a sense, started, like Jeremiah said, by this realization that, well, consciousness exists and we can use this fact, this ground in truth that is irrefutable, immediate. You can use other words to describe this this fact, and how you know about your own experience existing. You can use it to then say, okay, well, how do I exist that? How do I know that other things exist, like the external world and maybe even other minds? But in an epistemological sense, IIT tries to do also jump into ontology and get ontological conclusions. But on top of that, even about experience itself, IIT unpacks a little more. What can we actually not only say about the existence of conscious, but its properties, right? So we will see that the following axioms are starting from, so to speak, experience as phenomenal existence, and then asking the questions, okay, what are the properties of this thing that exists, that are essential, that are true of every conceivable experience, right?
Well, let me ask one question also, that we use this word axiom for it. And we'll probably talk more about this, I think, in probably the next episode. But people should probably also not overinterpret the term axiom, because sometimes if people come, for example, from a mathematical background, they say, wait a minute, an axiom doesn't have to be actually true or false. It's simply something that you posit, that you just state as being, well, this is our starting point, and then from there, what kind of a logical system can we create? And in IIT, we're actually doubling down on the word, on the meaning of axiom even further than that, by trying to say, well, it's not only the starting point, right? An axiomatic starting point for everything else that we're going to infer on top of that. But we also think that it is a ground truth with the capital T, of meaning it's a truth that you really cannot refute. Anyone want to talk about other
I think this is
things to do with? Oh, I have one other question for us. So we use these words. We describe the axioms, and starting with the zeroth, we describe them as being immediate and irrefutably true. And so I think out of context, I've even seen this in a couple of critiques of IIT. Out of context, it can sound very arrogant. I think in the first place, it sound very, whatever, just yeah. I mean, it sounds out of place.
It's a good word, right?
It's a good word, maybe out of place to say such a statement. But what do we mean by that in IT? Because we're actually not trying to be arrogant. We're trying. It's actually sort of a humble statement. if you really get the meaning that is an IIT.
All right.
Do either of
Tell
you
me
guys
how
want
it's
to unpack that at
no,
all?
you tell me how it's humble, Jeremiah.
Well, so it's humble. Well, so first, the meaning of immediate. It's just trying to mean it's right in front of your eyes. It doesn't require logical inference, right? So if 2 + 2 is 4, that's not an immediate truth. It requires a logical inference. It's one more step. But experience, the fact of seeing red, for example, you don't have to justify to anyone else or to yourself, how, like, do I see red? You simply see it. It's an immediate truth. It's right there before your eyes, so to speak. I think another phrase that's used in philosophy is something like by direct acquaintance or something like that. There are probably different phrases people have used, but it's just that there's no other basis for it besides just the fact that you're experiencing that. It's immediate in that sense. And you might be wrong. So I should also clarify, if I'm looking at a normal red apple, and I see it as red, okay, that's an immediate truth. But also if it's actually a Granny Smith green apple, but I'm looking at it under a red light filter, and I say I see a red apple, my experience of the redness of that apple is still immediately true in my experience for me, right? So immediate just means that. And I don't know if maybe humble isn't the right word, Björn, but it's not.
It's trying to get at a relatively simple thing, even though it's
exactly
right.
Yeah. It's not trying to be pedantic of saying, well, it's something everyone should immediately recognize or something. It's meaning just, yeah.
I think one way that go ahead. Sorry.
Maybe the axioms are not. What I'm trying to say is that maybe something that is humble is the aim to focus on properties that are so basic, like you say, so fundamental, so essential that they might even sound trivial. They might even sound, there's not really
or circular or like.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like saying something that is so basic, like you said, so fundamental. It just describes a property that is always there. There's nothing controversial about it. So that's the humble side, is that axioms should really be something uncontroversial in a sense.
Yeah, I think something that helped me with that word immediate, I think was, just thinking about the variation of the word that is unmediated. Like it's not mediated by anything else, like you said. But I think just catching that, what should I say, like rhetorical connection was for me helpful. It's not like, oh, my experience is something and then it's mediated by something else and it gives me knowledge about some ephemeral other thing. The experience is just exactly that thing that is there present for me here, right?
Yeah.
So for me,
sometimes philosophers talk about the fact that the subject has privileged access to their experience. It is private, but also it is direct. It is immediate, exactly, right? So it's a little bit like there's nothing in the world that mediates the fact that, for instance, I don't know, when you're dreaming, you're just having an experience of, I don't know, a red apple, and that's just what's in your experience. That's it. So yeah.
And I think the irrefutable is also a better word than what was used in the past, which was indubitable, I think, right? Where irrefutable kind of gets at this notion that, you can try to refute the fact, but if you do it, you'll run into a contradiction in the end, and it just kind of breaks down. It's like, so if you try to say, well, let's try to refute the fact that experience exists, I mean, just by virtue of the attempt at refutation, you're forced to be within an experience in order to try to refute it, right? It's like you can't, like the refutation, like just snuffs existence out of existence, which just doesn't make sense neither logically nor in any way, right? So it's like you just run into these problems. So irrefutable to my ear just means that you can try to refute the fact, but if you do it, you run into a contradiction that is just
In fact, in mathematics, I think I learned from Billy, our colleague, our IIT colleague, Billy Marshall, that in mathematics, and he's a statistician, mathematician, there's a phrase proof by contradiction as well, or the way of proving some sort of mathematical truth also through contradiction. You can think of this irrefutably true point as being like proof by contradiction, proof through contradiction. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
actually,
great.
to respond to the other point that you asked, Björn, of how does IIT's take on the zeroth axiom, how does it differ from Descartes? This would be another nitpicky point where Descartes' language that he uses is exactly this indubitable, or the French equivalent of that. He uses this term indubitable, and I think in the argument that he was making, a more accurate word would have been irrefutable, because of course you can doubt, right? Doubting is a cognitive exercise of calling into question the truth of something. But the point is that through doing that, through your doubting, you end up accidentally confirming, because your doubting itself is also an experience. Therefore, oh, even if I try to doubt it, it only then confirms that the experience exists. So you can say it's irrefutable because it can't be refuted, but it can indeed be doubted. So these basic points of being immediate and irrefutably true of every conceivable experience, we'll talk about it more in the future when we look at all of the axioms, and we might dig in a bit more to what we mean by axiom, etc. But that was just sort of a teaser, because it already applies to the zeroth axiom.
Yeah.
All right. So in IIT's method, we start with this fact that experience exists, and then we try to make some incremental inferences to get a science of consciousness off the ground, to try to account for this fact of experience scientifically. So you can say in the next step, we're then moving from the immediate and irrefutable truth of our own experience to now ask, okay, what is a reasonable inference that I can start making about the outside world? And so we start with 3 methodological assumptions. Before we dig into these, well, we can just label them first. I mean, we call them realism, operational physicalism, and atomism. So IIT, again, is very systematic in laying out its assumptions to begin with. But maybe a nice meta question to kick this conversation off with is, why do we do this in the first place? Why don't we just assume, the standard model of physics, assume all we know about neurons and mini columns and neural connectivity and so on? I mean, why do we do this? I mean, almost pedantic approach of, starting so granularly with these very small inferences of, methodological assumptions from the beginning.
First of all, I don't, so like historically, I'm not really sure whether, the starting point was making all these assumptions and then you move to the next step, which we will get to with the postulates and so on. But I think this is something that has come and become more precise and better described and laid bare with the later versions of the theory, where, you kind of have to grapple with the fact that you can't jump directly from an axiom to, in this case, the zeroth postulate. In order to get there, you have to make some assumptions. And I think this is, again, something like we talked about earlier, is an aim in the theory to make all of these assumptions explicit. And as you grapple with this, there are certain assumptions that you just need to make in order to go from this just bare bones claim that experience exists, in order or to get to some sort of scientific claim, such as saying that some sort of physical system needs to exist to have this experience. I need to, you need to kind of, in order to get there, you need to make certain assumptions of what you define as being a physical system, and you have an implicit assumption there that there exists such a thing as a physical system, and what does it take to kind of be a composite, like, physical system built up of building blocks, and how can we kind of model or even go out and operationally figure anything out about such a system. So I think for me, I think it's useful to already now just make those things very clear and explicit, with the goal in mind of wanting to get at a formalizable and principled kind of way of talking about what we even mean by a physical system that might support or specify or have consciousness.
I think to say what you just said in slightly different terms, I also think that IIT tries to, so, when you start from something subjective like experience, and then you try to build a science of consciousness, there is a question: how do you bridge this gap between starting from your own experience and then talking about a physical world and in quantitative terms. And I think it's fair to say that IIT is probably one of the first attempts to, bridging this gap by starting from experience and then building a science of consciousness. And it is simultaneously trying to build an explanation of consciousness and also reflect on what it means to start from consciousness and then build a scientific explanation of consciousness. So there is, in a sense, a part of IIT that is doing some philosophy of science, is reflecting on the question, what should a science of consciousness look like, and how do you start from experience and then go to a physical explanation of consciousness. So the methodological assumptions are, let's say, an attempt in doing some housekeeping, in saying not only we do this to build our explanation, but also we maybe codify the way in which we think a science of consciousness could bridge this gap, right? And I think this happens in other sciences too. Sometimes in quantum mechanics or in physics, there are some very theoretical statements that then reflect on our conception of science itself, so change and these are, of course, topics that are widely discussed in philosophy of science debates. I think IIT is trying to do something like that, making explicit some assumptions that allow us to bridge this gap. That's why I think there are implications on, regardless of IIT and having the specific claims that it makes or the specific details to build this explanation. I think it's interesting to consider the claims that IIT makes in terms of what any theory of consciousness should probably try to achieve.
Yeah, I agree, right? Because one thing that you might be kind of tempted to say, like if you start from your own experience, you could just throw up your hand. Oh, sorry. You could just throw up your hands and be like, all that exists is my experience. This is the universe. This is all that there is. This solipsistic notion where like I'm the only thing. Just so happens that I'm having the experiences that I have, and that's that. But that doesn't kind of help you if you want to believe, that there is an explanation. You can't bootstrap an explanation, as far as I know, except like it just happens to be that way from a solipsistic starting point, which I think is one of the reasons why the realism assumption comes in as the first assumption in IIT, is that you are assuming that there is such a thing as the real physical world out there, so to speak, that is accessible somehow, that you can kind of, that you can interact with in some way, and there is stuff there to be to help you ground an explanation.
Yeah, so why don't we roll with what you've started us off with here with realism? So the first, just to formalize it a sec, the first methodological assumption we make is realism, that something else exists besides my own experience. You could say the only thing it's really trying to do is refute the solipsistic or the potential to go the solipsistic route, to just say, okay, if we are solipsists, there's no point in doing science, and we can't even get a science off the ground.
I think the argument, I think it's maybe the other way around. Like I think we end up refuting solipsism by trying to explain why our experience looks the way it does, right? And the idea is that when we wake up, we have an experience of the room and the table, etc. And it looks like there's an external world, but we can ask ourselves, well, how come that my experience is so regular? How come that when I am dreaming, everything is changing all the time, but when I am awake, usually things are pretty stable, right? And these regularities in experience there must be a reason if you want to appeal to the principle of sufficient reason. And of course, you can say, well, I am just making up everything, but a much better explanation is that there is a world out there. There are things that justify why when I don't know, I close my eyes and I open my eyes, my water bottle is still there. And the regularity is my experience. Therefore, call for an explanation that there is something that is beyond me that justifies why things look the way they are. And of course, as a consequence, this also means that if there's something more than just my experience that justifies why contents of experience are so regular, then solipsism is refuted in a sense that I can say, well, it's a much better explanation that not only I exist with my experience, but something else exists to explain these regularities.
And so how does this notion of realism, which at least the way I interpret it is as being as minimal as possible. You could even say it's not even ontological yet, in the sense that you're not saying what else exists, you're just saying something else exists, right? It's super minimal. How does it compare with or contrast with other notions of realism, whether what's called naive realism or scientific realism?
The way I understand naive realism is that you kind of just take for granted that, you know, when I see an object in the world, or when it appears like this microphone is in front of me, you know, you take that to mean that, oh, I am in direct acquaintance with the world outside, and there is such a thing outside of me that is, you know, a microphone, and, you know, that is the thing out there. But in IIT, this my experience of the microphone is something that is private to me. It probably is brought about due to some sort of causal interaction with something out there that reliably brings about a certain type of experience in my for me. But that doesn't mean that the content of my experience, the microphone, as though it's in front of me, doesn't mean that it, you know, that thing is really you know, out in the world.
Well, I agree with you that the notion of realism in IIT is very minimal. It just says that there is something else beyond my own experience that must exist. And it's not committing to anything. Like, for instance, not committing necessarily to what our current physics tells us exists out there, which might be just fundamental physical particles and forces. It is not committing to there being tables and chairs. It just says something else exists. Then doesn't mean, of course, that we don't aim to have a complete description of the world. And then actually, as we will see later in later episodes, IIT strives to get a complete description of what exists out there, but this is just an assumption to start the quest for an explanation of consciousness and of reality and what exists. One other comment I have is that there is another notion of scientific realism that is more about, so we can be realist about the entities and the notions that science talks about. And again, here we can say, if it's useful to talk about atoms, then we are committing to basically the existence of atoms. So we are scientific realists in the sense that we say everything that we talk about in science, all the tools and the notions and the concepts that we use, reflect something true, that is real, that exists out there. And again, IIT is has a weak form of realism because it actually strives to describe physical reality in terms that are as simple as possible. And as we will see very soon with physicalism, this just requires maybe some notion of cause-effect power or causal interactions or causal constraints or even just conditional probabilities. It doesn't really commit to the existence of specific entities, at least at this stage, or forces or ways for things to interact through magnetic fields or you know, gravity or other things, without saying that these notions are not legitimate. Like physics, of course, talks about these things, but
right. So that might be a nice bridge into talking about physicalism also.
Wait,
did you want to add something, Björn?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's adding, or if I have a question that I like wonder about. So in this notion of realism, because we start from our own experience, right? And then we go out there and we say, okay, something else exists, as we've talked about a lot in this realism part. But I do wonder, is there also like some sort of a you know, self-referential thing here where you say that I'm not something special, so given that something else exists that is real and I'm part of, you know, the universe, so to speak, I also exist in the way that the stuff out there exists, that I'm not something unique and different from all the other stuff that exists, so to speak. Does this ever show up in in IIT? Is it in realism or elsewhere?
I think it's true. I think realism is basically trying to say, if I start from the existence of my own experience, and I already noticed that there are regularities in my experience, and I want to account for regularities in my experience, then a good next step is to assume the existence of something else that explains the regularities in my experience, right? So I'm a realist about the existence of these other things, and somehow it's building this bridge between my experience, its contents, and what's out there. And then, as we will see even more with physicalism, the idea is that there should be an explanation that is consistent and complete and exhaustive, that explains both my experience, its contents, its regularities, and how other things that exist outside of my experience interact with my experience, with the same tools, with the same language, with the same concepts. And we can probably already jump into the next assumption, which is physicalism, which says, well, how do we define existence in these terms that allows me to bridge my existence with the existence of something else? And a good way to talk about these other entities or these other things that exist beyond my experience is the language of operational physicalism or cause-effect power.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, but this bridge between realism and physicalism, a useful way to frame it is also tying it to the conversation we were having before about differences with IIT's realism and naive realism or scientific realism, where, you know, in other forms of realism, people not only think that something besides my experience exists, but they have specific ideas of what it is, right? So as Björn was saying, like, this microphone exists, period. And in IIT's approach, we rather just say, wait, I don't know what exists, I just know that something else exists. And then in order to figure out what exactly exists, if you want, we could say something is real, but to figure out what is real, I have to then have another methodological assumption, which is then where the physicalism and then the atomism come in. So physicalism is our first, let's say, guiding principle to figure out what out there exists. And it's the IIT notion is kind of a modern version of a very, very classical principle that's known as the Eleatic principle. I don't know much about it in the history of philosophy, but I think it hasn't been talked about by many people, at least for the last couple hundred years. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you know more, Matteo.
The Eleatic principle, we refer to in the philosophical debate also, comes from the Plato's sophist dialogue, where there is the Eleatic stranger that says a sentence that is something to the effect of, to exist is to be able to affect and be affected by something else. That is the mark of being. And I would disagree that it hasn't been discussed as much in the philosophy, especially metaphysics, of the past century or centuries. It has been sort of lurking beneath the surface, but I definitely agree with the fact that it wasn't considered a defining feature of existence and taken as a guide in principle to basically building an ontology. There has been, in the past decades especially, a resurgence of neo-Aristotelian approaches that take, for instance, powers, ontology of powers, dispositions, as a way to describe properties that exist out there in the world, and in general, every property. So they tie together existence with powers, which really means this capacity to affect and be affected. But I think what IIT does is to take the notion, the Eleatic principle, refine it a little bit, and also building on it to define a mathematical framework that allows us to actually quantify and define rigorously what we mean by cause-effect power.
I think, for me, I think this this notion of making a difference, or having the capacity to make a difference, or being, for something to be real or exist out there, you need to be able to kind of interact with it. So a basic way of interacting with something is just observing it. So by virtue of, if you observe something, it literally needs to interact with you in order for you to see it, there needs to be some sort of photons that interact with your retina that further bring about some sort of state of your brain, so to speak, so that you have the experience of seeing or hearing or touching. All of these things involve physical, as we call it, interactions, meaning that something makes a difference to you, right? So that's one way, but this also kind of implies the capacity for me to make a difference to a thing. So if I go out and try to touch the microphone, for example, I go out and interrogate, so to speak, the world around me. And when I try to shift it to one side, it does that, it changes the way that I observe it, so to speak. So when I try to make a difference out in the world, it is reflected in making a difference on me. So I think this notion of a basic way of thinking about this notion, this physical existence, is that in order for me to reasonably infer that something else exists, I need to be able to make a difference to it, to manipulate it. And it needs to make a difference to me. It needs to be able to change me in some way. Mm-hmm. So I think this more basic terminology of saying making a difference, or being able to make a difference to something else, and it being able to make a difference to me, is a reasonable, simplistic way of thinking about a minimal requirement for inferring that something else exists.
The general idea, as Björn said, is that we can define powers in a stricter mathematical sense if we use the language of conditional probability, which is something that philosophers have not done before. Philosophers have always been talking about properties such as fragility, or the power to heat, or the power to cut, as prototypical examples of powers. But in this case, the notion of what it means for something to be physical and to have cause and effect power is made more precise.
And I think one thing that has become more and more clear to me, or I don't know, like the importance of what we bring to bear when we talk about like making a difference. For example, there are certain assumptions there, like when I say, oh, I can make a difference to this microphone, for example, first of all, I kind of define a unit or a thing or an entity that I can make a difference to, that I bring to bear, that I have as almost as like a hypothesis of what exists out there. And when I say that I make a difference to it, what I mean, at least I think, is that I'm changing the state of that thing. So I kind of implicitly bring about some sort of definition of what kinds of states or states of affairs can the entities that I'm positing kind of be in, and what happens if I change the state. And I think that is kind of necessary in order to talk about powers in a more kind of formal mathematical way, is you have to be very explicit about what you take to be the thing that you're interrogating or manipulating or observing. So you have to clearly define what the unit or the entity that you're trying to assess the existence of. You need to specify its borders and so on and so forth. And you need to also specify what are the states that I'm kind of interested in. I could be very like detailed about it and say like, only taking into account the positions of this thing, I can say, okay, 1 millimeter to the left or 2 millimeters to the left. I can define a bunch of states and say, well, if I move it over here, just 1 millimeter over here, now I've changed the state of it a little bit, and then I can see what kind of effects that has downstream and so on, and how that changes, for example, photons in my retina, or like the states of cells in my retina, and I can say something about its effects, So changing the state of something, or what I'm just trying to say here is that you have to be very precise about the thing that you are trying to figure out whether exists and in what way. You have to kind of define it very properly, and also you have to define what are the operational sets of states that you kind of use when you interrogate it, or when you assess it or study it. And in order to get at these conditional probabilities that Matteo was mentioning, is like you go out and you take an experimental approach to figure out what exists. You go out and you set the system or the entity or the unit that you want to assess into a certain state, and then you see what happens. So you can kind of build up this kind of detailed list of what we call state transitions, for example, where you say, if I set the system that I'm interested in into a particular state, the following what should I say, time step, or in the next moment, a certain effect tends to happen, and it happens with this reliability, where it's, you know, with a certain probability, and so on and so forth. And you can go out and you can set the system that you're interested in into all possible states, and then you can kind of go about as rigorously and as completely as you wish, finding all of these conditional probabilities. And that lays the groundwork for what you kind of need in order to then mathematically compute, basically, the powers of the thing that you are interrogating, given the precise definitions that you have kind of brought to bear, right? So the borders and the composition of the thing and its available states, so to speak. But it also doesn't go any...
Björn, can I interrupt you and dig into why is it that we insist so much on not only observing but also manipulating? Why is that so important? Because you've used this phrase a few times of talking about manipulating something and observing. But if I want to figure out the causal powers of something, I can also just watch, right? I can just, you know, look into, well, not much is happening in any of the rooms there that I'm looking into, but okay, if it's a scene in nature, you know, you see a rock roll down a hill, you see a bird fly, you see the wind blow, you observe causal powers out there. And so you can make inferences about what exists based on just what you're observing. Or if we were to apply this to the brain, if I just observe certain patterns of neural activity, can't I just as safely make inferences about causal patterns, causal interactions between neurons?
Yeah, I think this is not unique to IIT, but I think it's very just basic science in a sense, and it has to do with this what should I say, this cliche almost that is well known as the correlation is not causation. And you can observe things as much as you want, but if you don't go in and manipulate or perturb the system or set the state in a controlled way, then you may all the changes that you see may just be due to, for example, unobserved underlying changes, for example, or there may be all sorts of reasons why certain things appear to correlate or change in a particular way. Doing these controlled interventions is a foundational and basic requirement in order to get at causal properties, so to speak. It's part of like the Pearl's mathematical framework of introducing the do operators that have been, you know, very influential, and I think rightfully so. And I think it's part of medical sciences, the insistence of doing randomized controlled trials. You have to do perturbations. There are maybe reasons why people get sick or seem to get sick, but then you look at, if you infect a bunch of people with the virus, then they do in fact get sick because of the virus. It's not, because of some other causes. It's not because they live in a poor neighborhood, for example. It's like there are all sorts of spurious correlations that may appear as though they are causally relevant, but then when you go in and do this perturbation or manipulation in a controlled fashion, you see that what you thought was the cause or causal influences turn out to be completely irrelevant.
Another thing that is important about perturbation is that, and this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but when we study an object or a system that it's in front of us, if we just observe, we don't actually know that, assuming that like Bjorn said, we can conceptualize anything like a system as a set of units in a state. If we just observe, we actually don't know whether the system is visiting all its possible states or it is just staying in one state. I mean, for instance, you can think about a scientist who's trying to study a new type of plant, and if it just observe it in the jungle in its own natural environment, it doesn't change, but maybe you bring it to the laboratory, to your lab, and then you expose it to different kinds of light, you try to play with water, expose it to different types of chemicals, and then you see how the plant reacts. So you are actually having a larger a set of observations that tells you how the plant reacts to all the possible states of, in this case, the environment. And so a more complete characterization of a phenomenon or an object really, in a sense, comes with going there and probe it, right? I don't know, push it with a stick and see how it reacts to see it visit more of the available states. I think this is an important difference also in observing versus perturbing or manipulating.
I have one more question about operational physicalism. Well, maybe more than one. But one important thing to clarify is this word or this phrase, cause-effect power. IIT has a lot of terms, a lot of special terms. That's why we have a whole glossary in the wiki to help people. Why do we use this phrase cause-effect power? Why don't we just use the more standard causal power or causally constrain? Or
well, one reason is that, as we said before, I think IIT is trying to unpack and make more explicit some assumptions that are not necessarily foreign to science in general, and also to metaphysics and philosophy when we talk about causation. So one idea that was already implicit in the Eleatic principle, in a sense, is you really need, for something to exist, the ability to affect something else and be affected. And this can be packed, into the notion of causal powers. But actually, when we study, especially a physical system that is the substrate of consciousness, it turns out that it is important, the type of causal constraints that something can have on the cause side or on the effect side. So the way in which a system can be affected by something else or by itself and can affect, the two things can actually diverge. There can be,
and these concepts also, if I can just connect briefly to history of philosophy, the notion of what do you call it, active powers and passive powers. It's also exactly. Not something brand new, but IIT systematizes it a bit more, because every notion of power in IIT is based on, as you mentioned, Björn, probabilities, right, or conditional probabilities, right? So do you want to dig into that a little bit? I mean, of maybe connecting. So you were saying, Matteo, that any system or any unit in a system is going to have both cause power and effect power that can be assessed actually individually. I think I interrupted you when you were saying that.
Yeah, it's I think an exhaustive account of what something is in physical terms and how it exists physically, as we said, as to come in terms of its powers, and characterizing how it can be affected by something else or itself, and how it can affect itself or something else, needs to be done in steps. So the way in which something can be affected and can affect might diverge, might be different, right? You can imagine the role of a set of neurons in a brain, the way in which we can receive inputs and then produce outputs to other neurons can be different. So we want to characterize all these two aspects in rigorous terms, but separately. And similarly, when we just talk about the way in which we can observe and manipulate something, these two aspects are both crucial. This translates mathematically also in some differences in considering the input side and the output side. We will get more into that probably later. I don't know if, Björn, you want to say something about mathematizing cause and effect, and why it's not, and not everything is symmetric. In a sense, we already mentioned that, but
I feel like we probably shouldn't get too deep into that here. Maybe we can get back into that when we get to the actual maths page, which is much later. But people are free to kind of get into all of the maths, either by reading the latest papers or by going to the wiki for the computing phi. I think we have some slideshows that are also helpful, I think, and yeah. But I do think it's important to emphasize, or maybe one thing that is important to emphasize is this notion of this phrase taking and making a difference. So your powers don't only depend on how you can affect the world, but also, like you said, how you can be affected by the world. So this is, kind of emphasizing the present moment. So your powers here and now are not only what should I say, quantified by or characterized by the differences that you can make in the world, but also the differences that you can take from the world, given your current state, so to speak. So that's how, so the differences you can make are kind of characterized as the effects you can have, whilst the differences you can take are characterized by the causes that you can be affected by, so to speak. So yeah.
So when we talk about trying to figure out what exists based on manipulating and observing, things, we inevitably fall into talking about, whatever, poking this microphone or this unit or this neuron, and then observing what it, the causes it can bear, or the effects they can have on other neurons or whatever else. And it's very easy, and I think part of the problem here is the limit of language, but I want to tease out what's a limit of language and what's a conceptual contradiction. On the one hand, saying we're trying to figure out what exists, but on the other hand, in the process of trying to figure out what exists, we're poking things out there and seeing the effects that they have and bear from other things.
I mean, we have certain hypotheses or ideas about what we think exists, and then we define clearly what that hypothesis is. For example, I believe there's a microphone in front of me, and I define it to, I think it has all these potential states, right? And then I go out and I test my hypothesis. If it so turns out that, whenever I move my microphone, what I see as my microphone into a certain state, if it turns out that that manipulation makes no difference to the outcomes of anything in the world, then it turns out that my initial hypothesis or assumption of this microphone existing, it's a bad hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
It was wrong. So I go out and I try things, and this kind of happens all the time. I think we have certain assumptions
Mm-hmm.
about what exists out in the world, but if we go rigorously about it and we try to figure out, is this really a thing, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
and we kind of are clear about what we mean by that, then I think there's nothing wrong in being wrong. It's like we try
Mm-hmm.
we try to figure out whether the stuff out there in like this realism sense, this weak sense, whether that is actually stuff, and in what sense it's stuff, and in what what characterizes it in terms of causal power, and whether we're right in really calling it a thing, so to speak. It gets very deep very quickly in a sense. But I also think we should be agnostic about what's there, and we should be open about the fact that, or maybe not the fact, but that our assumptions about what exists are likely or possibly wrong, right? And the way we carve up the world in the way that it appears to us has turned out again and again throughout history to just not be, precise or fundamental or anything like that. So I think it's perfectly fine, and having some sort of formal, principled way of testing our hypotheses that's a good thing.
I like to think about it. Right now with science, we have a lot of developed, instruments and tools, and we usually make examples of things we can see and touch, like poking something with a stick. But maybe if we really wanted to be sort of like a little more extreme, we would have to imagine, let's say we are trying to explore, the ocean, and we are in a submarine or like some sort of like scientific, vessel or probe, and then we send out we have a sonar. That's all we have. We send out this signal, and sometimes we realize that, there might be something 100 meters in front of us, but we had no idea. We have no idea what that is, how big it is. We just see that there's something there, right? And then we can refine our manipulations and our observations by getting closer. So then we can understand maybe that the thing that we thought was in front of us is actually multiple things, is I don't know, maybe a school of fish or something, and then we can inspect with other tools. We can shed light and see the shape of this thing. We can actually look inside that thing. So scientific endeavor is more like, progressing in steps, and I think that's why IIT tries to divide each step by first just saying we perturb and observe, and this doesn't mean that we have exhausted our knowledge of what's in front of us. We gain knowledge in steps. I also want to connect this point to one last point about physicalism that I think is very important, which is, if we say that to describe what something is in physical terms, we have to use the language of cause-effect power and ask, how is this thing affected and how can it affect things? Then it sounds like we're talking about not what it is in itself, but how it is affected and affects other things, right? So how it interacts with other things. But we're also aiming
and
to
also
describe...
assuming that, and also potentially assuming the thing exists in the first place, right? I mean, like,
Right.
it can
Right.
seem like that.
Yeah. So one good question would be, how can we go from cause-effect power that seems to describe how a thing interacts with other things to an explanation of what something is in itself, so to speak, right? So that's one big question. And I think for now, we will get there with the notion of intrinsicality and etc. But for now, I think I would like to say that cause-effect power includes the way in which something affects and is affected by itself. So there is already, it's not necessarily input-output with other things, but it is also its ability to take and make a difference to itself, which we'll see is actually in the end key. So yeah, just a teaser of how to bridge this gap between.
Right. So one important thing before we move on from physicalism is physicalism is not the same as materialism. I mean, we have a whole FAQ on this. We have the FAQ asking, if IIT assumes physicalism, does this make it a materialist theory of consciousness? I feel like the word materialist is kind of slowly dying out. But do either of you want to engage with that at all?
I mean, one thing that is brought up very often is that our notion of what exists in physical terms is slowly, in a sense, moving away from the notion of matter, right? Before, matter seems to somehow evoke this idea of fundamental
Solidity.
components, some bricks or something solid, but contemporary physics tells us probably about fundamental physical forces or fields, particles that can be seen as particles or fields or energy, or so the notion of matter definitely has been heavily revised, at least. This, though, doesn't mean that there isn't a view that we can call physicalism that says that in principle everything that exists can be described in purely physical terms, and so everything that exists is ultimately physical. And I would like to just say that there are two notions of physicalism. One is operational physicalism and one is ontological physicalism. And at this stage, the assumption of IIT is merely about operational physicalism, which really means we take physicalism as a methodological assumption. We want to investigate the universe using the tools of physics or cause-effect power, interacting, manipulating, observing things, but by no means we say that everything that exists ultimately is exclusively physical. And I want to also open just a small parenthesis here to say things are a little more complicated than that, right? Because there is a sense in which for IIT, everything that exists ultimately is also physical, in the sense that if you describe physical reality correctly, so you describe it in, for instance, in intrinsic terms, you have an ontology that tells you what exists for itself, then you can describe the physical properties of whatever exists for itself intrinsically. Therefore, everything that exists in the universe, according to the ontology of IIT, is physical, but it is not only physical in a sense, right? It is also phenomenal, because every entity that exists intrinsically and physically for itself is also a conscious entity, a subject of consciousness, a substrate of consciousness. So the idea is that at this stage, physicalism is an operational assumption. It is not ontological in the sense that everything can be reduced to traditional physical entities and physical properties.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would like to add something, or at least in my understanding, if you ask, like, is IIT a physicalist or a materialist theory of consciousness? You could take it to mean, you know, do you rely on anything else than physical things, so to speak, in order to account for and explain consciousness? And in that sense, to that question, the answer is no. You only refer to physical properties when you account for or explain the conscious experience that you might be having, for example, right? So you don't add anything beyond physical, what should I say, facts fully characterized, so to speak. They're only, or would you say that you do? I mean, you only take into consideration the stuff that you can in fact manipulate and observe, right? Which is how we defined physical in the first place.
Well, it becomes very complicated because
I agree.
So in one sense, I just want to stress, it is true that the explanation, the account might only rely on physical notions and concepts and tools. And so in a sense, the explanans, you know, how the explanation is carried out is purely scientific, rigorous, mathematic, quantitative, just in physical terms, in terms of cause, effect, power, and conditional probabilities. However, your ontology is not fully physicalist because you admit that consciousness exists and consciousness is consciousness phenomenon, right? So the other bit that is I'm honestly unsure about, I think it's debatable, is whether the tools that you use to build your explanation are always physical. So for instance, when we talk about introspection and phenomenology in the sense that I introspect my own experience, the knowledge that I gain about experience that I want to use, the tools of reflection, introspection, counterfactual reasoning about my own experience, this is data in a sense that I use to then account for consciousness scientifically, and does that count as physical in a sense, right?
But Matteo, if I can interrupt you there, I would still say all of the use of introspection in IIT is not really part of the explanans, right? It's not really part of the side of the ledger that is the account of, right? It's more like you use introspection and phenomenology to fully articulate the properties, your explanandum, right? The aspects of experience, not only that experience exists, but the specific properties of experience. You're trying to articulate what those things are, your object of study, so to speak. Although in this case it's subjective, but anyway, you're trying to articulate what that is. And then, as Björn's saying, on the physics side of the ledger, your full account of those properties is nevertheless in terms of in physical terms.
Yeah. I'm just saying that I wouldn't say that. I mean, to me, if you say that all the tools that you use are necessarily only physical and you're only mathematizing, observing, perturbing, I think it's a little. It's
a little bit too
maybe
much.
Yeah. I mean, I like to think about sciences like psychology as using introspection and then psychophysics and some other things as blurring the line between what counts in methodological terms, at least. Like, I think introspection is really bridging the gaps and moving between the two worlds. I don't like to think about two worlds that are completely separate from each other, especially when we talk about methodology, right? There are some properties that I like to call purely phenomenal, just experience, contents of experience. But the fact that, so for instance, when I get a subjective report from a person who's talking about their own experience, do I take this subjective report as data that I include in my legitimate observation and description just like when I record the firing rate of a neuron, or do I instead say no, this is not part of my scientific data set because it's this person talking about their experience? I genuinely think that introspective report is in a sense, objective, right? It is data, just like it is a brain scan. But I agree with you that the characterization of phenomenology is then what is translated into physical terms in IIT. That's a separate issue.
And I guess just to kind of bring us to the final assumption also, this, just even if it was the case that everything you use to account for or explain the experience was in fact fully physical, that doesn't mean that the experience that we're explaining in the first place reduces to the, ontologically at least, reduces to the physical, right? So there is still, the explanandum is there regardless of what you use to explain it.
So moving on then to our final assumption of atomism that Björn was just briefly mentioning. So the assumption we sometimes also call operational atomism, in order to distinguish it from reductionism, in the sense of saying consciousness is nothing but what we manipulate and observe. That's certainly not what is meant. So what do we mean by atomism? Why is this third operational assumption or methodological assumption useful?
I think it means that you have to, in order to characterize something that we take to exist physically, to characterize it fully, you need to not only consider it as one macroscopic entity, so to speak, but you need to look at what it's composed of, or what its constituents, so to speak, at the finest possible grain, and to get at fully what's there physically. So if I were to fully characterize this microphone, I can't just think of it as one thing, but I need to consider that it's a composite object, so to speak, that is constituted of smaller parts, and I can interrogate the parts individually or together in order to figure out how they are, what they are, and how they exist physically, and how they come together to form this hypothesized or inferred larger entity that I call a microphone. And I can kind of decompose things, make them smaller and smaller to the smallest possible part. And here, this operational atomism then gets at what is the smallest possible set of parts that I can reliably manipulate and observe. And in order to get at a full characterization of what exists here in front of me fully, I need to start from that smallest possible grain, at least in principle, and then take all of that information into consideration when I then try to figure out what is the most correct characterization of what exists here in front of me, and as what I see as a microphone.
Right. So to say that you break it down into its smallest parts that you can observe and manipulate, that is only done in an operational sense. You're not assuming that those smallest parts are what really exist, but you are assuming I have to be able to, for sort of good measure, or to do my due diligence here, I have to be sure to at least try to also apply my manipulations and observations at the lowest possible level, so that I make sure I'm not missing anything in my explanation.
Yeah, so I think the attempt that the assumptions are grounding is really to get a description of external reality, let's say, that is as exhaustive as possible, right? So if we were to say, oh, I see, I don't know, like a tower built out of Lego in front of me, and I just describe it as one entity, then I could observe it and perturb it. But if I weren't realizing that it's made of bricks, right, and the bricks have their own properties, then I would be missing out on some important key feature of the description of reality I'm trying to have, to build. And so this explanatory completeness that we're striving for calls for going down to the most basic constituents we can observe and perturb. Again, this doesn't mean that necessarily our view has to be that only the basic constituents exist and everything else is just an aggregate. And that's because actually our experience exists, and that doesn't seem to be a basic constituent. We can build a bridge with the fact that our experience has components, but it exists as one, including all these components. So we don't want to go to the smallest possible constituents or components to build an explanation that is complete.
Well, we do want to go to the smallest components to build it, but we don't want to then go on to say that just because we accept that there are components that are useful for accounting for why this one unified entity exists, that doesn't mean that you kind of lose the whole entity and are only left with the parts. In fact, you have the entity and the parts exist as parts of the larger entity. That is kind of what you get evidence for in this case, I would say, if that is what your investigation yields. And we will get back to how it can yield that in later episodes. It's not necessarily the case that just because I have an assumption that I have an entity in front of me here, and if I then start interrogating the parts, it may turn out that there is no entity at all. I'm just mistaken in my assumption, and in fact, it is just what did you call it?
An aggregate.
Accumulation. An aggregate, yeah. It could turn out that it is just an aggregate of many smaller parts, but we have to do this investigation properly, and see what comes out afterwards.
Yeah, and again, philosophically, oftentimes the notion of being composed or constituted, actually, the notion of a relation of composition between an object and its constituents is also taken as being basically synonymous with a notion of this object existing in a less fundamental sense, because the constituents exist in a more fundamental sense. But
right.
in IIT, these two things diverge. Like something can be constituted by other things without these things being more fundamental. And that's the key, really, of the reason why IIT is you could say, is a non-reductive view in this sense.
Ontological sense, yeah.
Yeah, in this ontological sense, because we will see even more later that you can have that systems of elements exist and they are in a sense more fundamental than their constituents, and similarly you can have mechanisms that include multiple elements and they exist in a more fundamental way, in a way that is irreducible to their elements. So this is a theme that will come up very often. Although methodologically, we also always want to check that the constituents are there and what they're doing. So methodologically, we assume atomism or reductionism, but not ontologically.
Okay, guys, so all of these methodological assumptions are our big build-up to the zeroth postulate. We already had the zeroth axiom, that experience exists, at the beginning of the episode. Then we go through these 3 methodological assumptions to figure out how can we start making inferences about what else exists in the outside world. And this leads us to our zeroth postulate, which, if I just read the phrasing of it, the substrate of consciousness can be characterized operationally by cause-effect power. Its units must take and make a difference. So there's not actually that much to unpack, because it's more or less the accumulation of the 3 previous methodological assumptions. But there are a few ideas here that we should kind of tease out. First, we use this phrase substrate of consciousness. What do we mean by that? I mean, do we simply mean a brain? Are we making that assumption all the way from the beginning? Or why do we use this kind of exotic phrase, the substrate of consciousness?
Well, so we started phenomenology first with the zeroth axiom by saying experience exists. And in particular, we then can refine the statements by saying, my experience exists, and I also realize that there are regularities in my experience, and from this I infer that something else exists in the world, and I can describe this something else in physical terms, operationally, and I can also consider its constituents. These are the 3 assumptions, right? But it turns out that when I ask myself, okay, so my experience exists, but I also have a body, right? And I have a head and I have a brain, and it turns out that there is this object in the physical world, in the external world, that is, let's say, my brain, that seems to be particularly connected to my experience, right? So we are trying to build a bridge between the existence of my experience from the first person perspective to a description of whatever out there in the physical world supports this experience from the third person objective, scientific, quantitative perspective. So substrate of consciousness is the term we use to describe the fact that my experience is somehow grounded somewhere in this physical world, and in this case it can be brains or subsets of a brain. But there is a physical object that seems to be, responsible in a sense for my experience being there, and I can find when I try to translate the properties of my experience into properties of something physical that exists in the physical world. So that's the exercise, I think.
And if I can say that this phrase substrate of consciousness, we try to cast the net as broadly as possible from the beginning to say, we don't know what the substrate of consciousness is, but we infer, as a phrase we use sometimes, it's an inference to a good explanation that there is something that we can consider a substrate of consciousness. And so the zeroth postulate says nothing about what that substrate is. It merely says the way for us to actually figure that out is by using perturbation and observation, using cause-effect power as our guide to somehow figure out what it is. And we have to do that. We have to use, let's say, cause-effect power all the way down, meaning we have to manipulate and observe whatever objects we're playing with to the most atomic level, using our atomic eyes and atomic hands to figure out what that substrate of consciousness is.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good, right? And we have already in previous episodes touched on this conjecture of the fundamental explanatory identity, and that it's built into the theory that we're kind of trying to, so given that there is such a thing as experience that exists in the natural world, if we want to account for it in physical terms, relying on these assumptions for what we mean by physical terms, so to speak, we can now say that there must be some entity there, some well-defined entity built up of a particular set of units, as we call them, building blocks or constituents, that by virtue of how they exist physically give a complete explanation, account for, or explanation of why I have an experience at all right now, and why it has the particular properties, contents, distinctions, and relations that it does, right? So it's kind of like, it says, in my head at least, there must be such an entity. There must be such an entity out there physically that I can interrogate and that I can characterize by virtue, by cause-effect power, that is constituted of a particular set of units, and those units, in order for them even to exist, a minimal requirement is that they must be able to take and make a difference. Otherwise, they wouldn't be, it wouldn't be reasonable for me to even characterize them as existing physically, right? So this is a very minimal claim, basically, to say that there must be a set of units that can make and take a difference out there in the world in order for me to even consider it to be a substrate of consciousness.
To me, the bridge between the axioms, well, the zeroth axiom and the zeroth postulate through the assumptions is also, in a sense, like Bjorn, you sort of said that it's this idea that if my experience exists and I have reason to think there is an external world that I can define physically with the language of cause-effect power, then it is also true that I am part of this world, right? And I must exist as a physical entity within this world. And the fact that I have an experience must correspond to something that I can describe physically in terms of cause-effect power, because I am an entity in this physical world. And I can also, of course, then get to the point of saying, I also have reason to believe I'm not the only conscious entity. You are also conscious. And so I can see other physical entities and infer that they probably are also conscious, right? So I can use this language of cause-effect power to describe existence, in this case, not phenomenal existence, but physical existence, even though the two must correspond, right? So the translation, in this case, the formulation of zeroth axiom into zeroth postulate, phenomenal existence into physical existence, is really the attempt to take the same thing that is having the experience in phenomenal terms and describe it in physical terms as something that exists physically, and whose properties must account for the properties of experience that I am observing when I introspect.
Okay, so on that note, I think we'll wrap up episode 2. Next episode, we are going to dig deeper into the 5 axioms and 5 postulates, which have as their basis the zeroth axiom and postulate, and all the methodological discussion that we had today. So see you next time.
See you next time.